All right, hello everyone. This is our first in the series of asynchronous tutorials that we'll have throughout the semester. This is kind of a abbreviated version because I know many of you are probably still looking to gather all the supplies since we only had our first class on the 5th. And I'm recording this on Monday, the 8th of September, so there's a good chance many of you, unless you ran out and bought everything you needed, at least for paper and that black Prismacolor pencils. Many of you may not have that yet, so I think that I'll have a bit more of an informal session today, and I'll discuss some of these topics on Friday of this week. So this one will be a little bit more general because I'll speak to a lot of the same topics, but I wanted to get everyone working on thinking about drawing and setting up perspectives in advance so that maybe by the time Friday rolls around, many of you will already be familiar with some of the basics. And so we can jump into another tutorial live instruction on Friday. And so today I'm just going to talk a little bit about perspective and setting that up. So I've kind of got a scratch piece of paper here, and some of the points that you'll hear throughout the semester, really the most basic ideas in perspective are horizon line and vanishing point. And so for those of you that have taken a drawing class in the past are probably very familiar with this, and others of you are new to drawing. This might be the first time you've ever heard these words. But vanishing point and perspective are things that we experience every day. We don't realize it, but they're all around us. And when we're thinking about drawing in perspective, they are the first things that you think about and how to set things up. So I'm going to be giving this talk, and then we'll do a tutorial based on what I think of as the most basic type of architecture, a kind of modernism. And I'll be looking at some examples from Mies, which is kind of like how to look at three-dimensional boxes at different scales. So the box, the cube, the most simple type of geometry to understand form and how it vanishes and moves as you walk through space. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But to start off with, I'm just going to run through some basics. So this is just not the kind of thing that you really need to follow along with, but just for explaining. So as we think about space, the horizon line is probably the first thing that comes to mind. So that is just as it sounds, the horizon, the distance, the extreme edge where the sky meets the earth. And so often this will be the first thing that we think about. Where is that positioned relative to the object that we're wanting to draw? And so normally buildings are larger than we are. They're higher. Parts of them are beneath our point of view, our horizon line, where we're experiencing these buildings. So if our horizon line is here and we're just walking down the street and passing buildings, most of those buildings are going to be above our eye level. And so if I'm just looking into a field here and I can draw a person's head, their body, legs, diagrammatically, just standing in space. Relative to my eye, let's just say this person is roughly the same height as me. And for simplicity's sake, I always try to think about that, that everyone is roughly the same height. Of course, people are shorter and taller, but just for the simplicity's sake of perspective drawing, I always think of people roughly the same height. So that person standing at this distance away from where I am as the viewer, another person standing way, way far away, also that person's eye is at the same height as me, so that all of our eyes are basically on the same line. All of our eyes are existing on that horizon line. And additionally, if a person is standing very, very close, people are not my strong suit, but there you go. There's a person standing much, much closer. But again, all three of them have the eyes at the same elevation relative to me. And so this gives you the impression that a person is larger, but also closer to me based on where their feet are, and but their head they're all, given that they're all standing, we see all those heads kind of aligned at the same point along that horizon line. This doesn't work as well when you have people standing and seated at the same time. So a seated person, of course, their heads will be much, much lower relative to that horizon line. And if each of these people are seated right next to the person standing, you could see that relationship is different. So the person seated here is going to be very, very small. And here, seated next to this person standing, their heads are a bit lower, of course, than the person standing adjacent to them. So it just gives you an idea of how the human relationship to that horizon line happens as you move from closer to you to further away. There is a relationship like this. So, and I only mention this when it comes to architecture because we need to understand where we are in relation to the objects we're drawing. So I'm going to get kind of messy here with this. I'm going to draw lots of ideas on top of one another just to hammer home this point. Let's say I'm drawing a building in the distance, and I'm standing, the building is 4 stories tall, and it's in the distance quite a ways from me, well, maybe closer to where these people are standing. So a 4-story building, the relationship to that, those people might be something like this. There's a building, it's 2 faces. So I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but this is an example of a 2-point perspective, given saying that the top of the building is vanishing in 2 directions. So one is vanishing to a point on the horizon line at some distance away, and the opposite side is also vanishing to another point. So we can see that our horizon line, is very, very low relative to that box, that building in the distance. Only this little bit is beneath our eye level because we're quite short in relation to a 4-story building. These might be 2nd floor, 3rd floor, 4th floor. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that person is really only this high relative to, say, a 15-foot floor to floor right there. So they're very small relative to us. Then, and that relationship, since the horizon line is so low, the building is really vanishing almost entirely down. And only the very base of the building do we start to see how those lines, also going to that same point on the horizon line, are vanishing towards that. So they're vanishing up into the distance. And all of these floor slabs are also coplanar, so they're also behaving in the same way. All of those are vanishing to these 2 points. Now, let's say that this is a kind of windy road, and now we have a building much taller. It's very, very close to us. We can see again, there's a corner of this building. Maybe it's only a couple floors now. Again, there's a person that stands right next to the building. That's the horizon line, the same horizon line that we have running all the way across. Now that this building is shorter, just to show the point here, maybe it's only 2 stories. And the geometry between these 2 buildings is different. So this face that I had drawn here is now not coplanar with this face. So if they're not coplanar, that means we've now set up a new series of geometries where we're still using the same horizon line, but the vanishing point is now been shifted. So for this building, we would have, and you can already see that some of this is going to be trial and error, and I'll get to some of those construction line ideas in a moment. But now we can see that the vanishing point for this face is pulled in quite a bit more. So now, originally, this building had a vanishing point on the horizon line here. Now we've altered the geometry for the face of this building. So now we're vanishing to a different point. And now we can start to see, openings. Maybe there's a curtain wall or a storefront opening. Some punched openings here, but all these horizontal lines are theoretically vanishing to that one point. Sometimes people will kind of put a pin in the point and then have a little thread or yarn, and then they can pull that yarn around, and it's kind of like a check on every line that you draw to make sure that it is in fact going back to that point. You can or you take a pencil or a ruler and you can just pivot around a point, and all those lines should be vanishing to that point. So if we live in a very, very gridded city like Milwaukee, for the most part, Chicago certainly is, we end up having a lot of parallel faces. So it is a little bit unusual that we see two buildings at varying geometries with different sets of vanishing points. Typically, we're kind of, looking down a street like this, and a lot of those building faces are parallel to each other. And that is an example where we're only looking down at one point on the horizon line. That is considered a 1-point perspective. So I kind of jumped ahead here talking about 2-point perspective. The easiest and most readily available to us to understand the teaching in perspective is a 1-point perspective. I don't like to talk too much about 1-point perspective because we don't experience much of the world in 1 point. One of the things that I like to stress is it complicates things, but wherever our field of vision is, our eye level, we are in everything closest to our eye, of course, feels and experiences it closer to us. It looks bigger. Everything then vanishes from your eye. And so really, even though for the sake of architectural drawing, there are very, very few parallel surfaces. It's kind of like a fisheye view. Everything is kind of warping away from you. And that's why we have to do a lot of this auto correction in photography to make the verticals look truly vertical. And so I'm going to just show an example here. This is kind of like a fisheye view of an image where you can start to see, I'm kind of expanding the view that you would normally have. Your eye normally is focused on a section of something. And here I'm really expanding the view, and you can see that I'm looking up. And so I'm enhancing that vertical idea by introducing a 3rd point, where everything is actually vanishing to the vertical as well as vanishing to a point and behind the bean here. Another point off the page to the right, and another point is actually vanishing off to the left. So this is a kind of extreme version, kind of the fisheye idea of everything vanishing away from your eye in a different way. So without complicating things too much, we're going to focus on the 1-point perspective just for ease of explanation, and the 2-point. And I'm wanting to jump into the 2-point right away because I would like everyone to think in 2 points rather than 1, because as you can see, the 1-point perspective is relatively flat. That means all of the horizontal lines are straight horizontal relative to your page. The top and bottom of each of these buildings that I'm looking at in elevation are flat. It's almost, I always talk about, it's like a Wes Anderson movie where you're always looking at something directly in its face. It's not like you're turning your head and looking at things obliquely. So that's why we start off looking at this and analyzing things in 2-point. So those are really the basics. And for the sake of this course, I also think it's important to stress the idea that we're going to be walking around Milwaukee. We're going to be looking at photos. I'm always going to try to illustrate things as if we're seated or standing on the ground. And the reason for this is the way things behave when you move up. If you're doing an aerial, the rules are all the same, but the way you experience them is different. And that can sometimes complicate things. So if the 3 examples that I like to give are the steps of how we experience things relative to whether we're looking up at them, looking straight across through them in the middle, or looking down. So if these are 3 different places of location relative to our object of the horizon line, the first one, which we've already talked about, we're right at grade, really low, only 5 or 6 feet off of the ground. The majority of those buildings are going to be above the horizon line. If this is a 4-story building and we went across the street and now we're on the 2nd floor looking at a 4-story building, half of that building is going to be above us and half will be beneath us. So it would look more like this, and the horizon line in the distance. Now, if you're in a tall building, or at least taller than all of your subject buildings, the horizon line is now higher relative to those other objects, and now we start to see roof lines something like this. So in each of these cases, the horizon line is moving relative to our object, whether we're on the ground halfway up or up above our subject matter. But in each case, these will all be vanishing to a point on the horizon. And sometimes those points of convergence on the horizon line can be well off our page, which is another challenge. Sometimes you will find that you don't want to draw a building the size that I've drawn here, where I'm only drawing it that big because I can fit the points. That's not very good planning, and you're going to end up with a lot of very tiny drawings because you drew them small enough to be able to fit the vanishing points on the horizon. So this is kind of the basics in architectural sketching, is understanding your vantage point relative to the subject matter and whether or not that horizon line exists primarily, I'll argue for the sake of this class, and maybe as we move further on and I see that we're all grasping this idea very well, we can move on to more adventurous things, elevating, looking down, maybe even using 3 or 4 points of perspective to show more dynamic views. But certainly the 1 point perspective here is the least dynamic. It's kind of looking at down the center of a corridor where we're not really expressing any angles or looking at things at a corner. The 2 point perspective, where we're looking at the corner of a building, it's more prominent to the face that's pointed towards us, that's closest to us. And then at 3 point perspective, we could start saying, looking at tall buildings, and like that example that I gave of the beam in Millennium Park, we could start looking at objects in great height where they're actually a vanishing point way off into the sky as well. So now we have 3 points, 2 points on the horizon line and 1 up into space. So these are all things to keep in mind. This would be the third 3 point. And there are many more. The fisheye is really like pushing things to the limit where everything is vanishing in every direction. So that's probably not the kind of drawing that we'll get into very much here. It's kind of an experimental thing, and it loosens you up to understand how your eye actually sees things. But I think we should stick to the 1 and 2 point for now to really master that before moving in further. So with this messy drawing, I think it would be good to kind of test our knowledge on some of these items. And so even though I had mentioned at the start that the 1 point is not my favorite, it is good to start that way because it helps us just come to the realization how the horizon line and vanishing points work in the most simple way. And so, like I mentioned at the start, using an example of Mies, which is like living in a Rubik's Cube of boxes on top of boxes, I will show an example here. And I have a book, so normally I'm going to try to have printouts that are much smaller so I can keep those images on camera as we're drawing it, and so you can make that comparison. So most of you probably know Mies from buildings like this. This is Crown Hall at IIT. And if you remember me talking on our last class about the type of drawings that we're going to try to do to stay away from elevational drawings, I want to point out this is an example of a kind of elevational drawing. It's not really an elevation. We can see there's depth. It's a photo. We can see maybe the most prominent piece of perspective here. This is a 1 point perspective. So you can see a person's head there. So our elevation relative to him, our horizon line is just about here. Everything is vanishing to a point right in the spine of the book. So that means I'm kind of connecting these lines. These upturned beams are coming down to that point, as well as all the stairs, the treads, the porch, this line that we can see expressed here where the light and dark surfaces are highlighting this edge. That's all vanishing to this point. it would be a fine drawing, but it doesn't really express a lot of depth. It's not very dynamic. It doesn't really give us an idea of volume. And so as I flip through this book, some other buildings will show this in a bit better when we talk about how we can express a three-dimensional drawing using 2-point perspective. So here at 860 North Lakeshore Drive, these are two images, basically one during the day and one in the evening. And here we can start to again see the idea of perspective, really just two simple boxes. But using this as a base is kind of like this iconic piece of architecture. We can start to make out form, whereas an elevation drawing of this building would not really lend itself to very much interest because it would just be a simple rectangle with other smaller rectangles within it. Granted, that still holds true, but now we start to see how each of these floor lines is behaving differently relative to the horizon line. So fortunately for this building being right on Lake Michigan, we can see the horizon line right down here near the base of the building. So this photograph is actually taken, I would say, roughly 12 to 18 feet above the ground. And I know that because the horizon line meets the building right at the underside of where this the tower actually springs from the lobby. So Mies has the exposed columns at the base of this building, and then an inset lobby. It looks like it's glowing as if it's the sun in this image, but you can see that there's just the structure coming down. It's really glowing, and that's straight. That line right there at the base is straight across the base of the tower, almost in line with Lake Michigan itself in the distance. So that's how I know, okay, that's my reference point. I know that the place that I'm viewing this building from is here at this elevation. And then the further up I get in the building, the more and more these floor plates are vanishing all to the same point on the horizon line. So I'm only focusing on this image to the left right now, but we could easily dissect this image and figure out exactly where that point is. Maybe way off the page. You can see here it's way off the photograph, but we can see. And so then you could start to angle your pencil down, and even the relationship to the building next to it, they will all have the same relationship as they all start to flatten out until you get totally flat at that horizon line. And then once you get beneath the horizon line, all of those lines are still vanishing to that same point. And so we can see kind of the geometry of the cars and the street down below. They're starting to kind of behave in a different way. They're continuously changing, but they're all meeting that same point off the page. So this is a great, easy to understand example of 2-point perspective. We can clearly see that the point that's the closest to us is this corner in both towers, and that's why it appears taller or higher than its other corners on the right and left. So every building uses the same ideas. Everything from the most simple, basic Miesian box to the most elaborate Gothic cathedral or classical Baroque architecture. Everything can be organized and simplified in a series of boxes and rectangles, geometries that you can easily understand, break it down, analyze, and then add detail to once you have the basics of perspective. So here again, another example of a 1-point. So a lot of Mies's buildings look very, very similar. That's the nature of his architecture. And in this case, I believe this is the Seagram building in New York. So this is Park Avenue, the building here. If you were to draw this in perspective, now I can see my horizon line is elevated. Of course, I'm much higher than all these people down at the base of the building, but just looking at this building on the side for reference, I can see that it's really flattening out about here, just about at the floor plate of the 3rd floor. And so then I can start to, if I know that's my horizon line in the distance, I can just start connecting these to this point, right? This is coming to a point here. That is really where my vanishing point is. So if I pin that spot right there, I can start to look at all the joints in the stone tiling or the concrete joints in the sidewalk, and they all start to react in the same way back to that point. But again, so that's a 1 point, not the most exciting image to really draw, so you might want to reconsider, just as I'm saying, with looking more at 2 point. And the one drawing that I really think will be interesting to start off with today is an image from 860 or 880 Lakeshore Drive, this. So this is a little deceiving because some of it appears to be a 1 point perspective, but it's actually hiding a second point. So some of you might see this already. It's primarily a 1 point. A lot of the geometry here is vanishing, all these parallel lines, moving away from us out to, again, Lakeshore Drive and Lake Michigan into the distance. So the horizon line is right out here, and we can tell that because if this was a colored image or a high res, we'd probably see the lake out there and we would know right away, oh, that's obviously the horizon line. But then we have so many clues. Every surface that's vanishing away from us is all going to a point right about here, right behind these leaves of this plant. And so this is how we can tell that it's a 1 point perspective. We've established a point there. So but it is actually not a 1 point perspective because we could draw it as such as being 1 point, but there's a little variation to this. And a true 1 point perspective, all of the lines that are running perpendicular to that point would be totally horizontal to our page. But you can see here, as you get closer and closer to where this photo was taken from, the lines start to kind of converge way off into the distance to the left. So instead of having these joints or this table be straight at the base like this, parallel to the base of the page, it's actually angled. So in looking at this, you could start to develop this as a 1 point perspective and say, okay, I see this, but I'm not going to respect it. I'm going to make that a totally flat horizontal line. And the same thing goes as you go up, now this mullion is also angled down to that same point to the left. And as you get higher, it's even more pronounced. So in looking at this photograph, you could replicate it by looking at it and using only the 1 point off into the horizon distance on page. And you could ignore these horizontals. Just have them straight across and not have them horizontally vanish to a point way, way off the page to the left. Or you could take that and also start using that and say, okay, I can't really measure that point, or at least it's very, very difficult, but I can start to see those drawing relationships and then start to utilize those in that point to the left. So I am going to take this image, and again, I apologize for not having a smaller image that we can look at, but I'll reference this. I'll bring it back on screen a few times so that we can see, we can check how things are looking. All right. So this is the pad of paper that I had asked everyone to purchase. This is the Strathmore, what is this, 60-pound 9x12 paper. This should serve you well for the majority of the semester. 100 sheets. You might want to use another sketchbook that gives you kind of scratch paper, much like I was just using here. This is a much, much cheaper kind of generic. I don't even know who makes this, but it was handed to me for free at an event, so I used it. But it's only 8.5 by 11. The quality is almost as good as a Strathmore, but if you're looking just to do messy stuff, you could use trace, you could use really anything. But for the drawings that you submit, I really do want to see them on this 11 or this 9x12, excuse me, paper, so that we're all looking at the same scales. All right. So that's the one that you'll be using for drawings. And for demonstrations, I'm using a slightly larger paper. It's still the Strathmore, it's still 60 pounds. It's just a little bit bigger so that when I'm in class, the page is just slightly larger. It's 11 by 14. So don't be confused. Stick to the smaller 9 by 12, but for demonstration purposes, I'll be using this, and I've already got a few sketches. All right. So again, this is the image that I'll be drawing from. That's the interior shot of I think it's 860 Lakeshore Drive in this case. Okay, so I'm going to pull this off screen, and I'm just going to be referencing it from the side, and then I'll keep referencing it back again and again. All right. So my screen fits almost perfectly to the page. So one of the questions that came up during class last week was the size of the sketchbook. And I mentioned that I wanted everyone to use that 9 by 12 because I want people to be comfortable with the amount of space they have to work with. So you could draw something small or larger, but I would rather you not go right to the edge. So we're already kind of making a border coming in an inch or two in each direction. So that as we plan our drawings, we're not planning things to go to the edge because, of course, if you are drawing something and you go a little bit beyond what you thought it would be, and you were planning on going right to the edge, now you're beyond the edge, and now you're going to have to make a sacrifice, which is either starting over or you have to sacrifice proportion or some other relationship that you might not want to do. Some of the biggest problems I see with drawings is not planning in advance and then end up cramming something in just to fit it on the paper, which instantly looks like a mistake. So if you can avoid that, it's best to plan in advance and not go to the very edge. It just gives you that extra little wiggle room to fix proportional errors that you come across as you go. So I'm going to start with pencil. And as we move through this, during these tutorials, we're primarily going to be using these black Prismacolor pencils. I have an electric sharpener here, which is great in some ways, but also not great because it chews through these very, very quickly. And so, you know, a $1.50 or a $2 pencil might not last more than a few drawings. It's important to keep them sharp, though. So it's good to have a sharpener much like this one. I don't think that I mentioned this in class on Friday, but this is just any real pencil sharpener will do. I think Prismacolor probably makes their own. I have a few here, the Stadler here, and this one is the Faber-Castell. I kind of go through them quickly. They do get dull. So, you know, after a few hundred sharpenings, then you can start to sense the fact that the pencil is going to start to get caught inside here, and then it starts to break. So it's good to have a clean, new-ish pencil sharpener to do this, because Prismacolor is soft, and you'll get through some lines, and eventually it's softer than HB, that's for certain, and you'll start to get very, very fat lines. You'll start to get kind of sloppy lines. So it's important. That's why I also mentioned you might want to get a pack of those black Prismacolors because they do go quick. And having a nice crisp edge, at least for line work, line value, and line weight, it's good to have a nice point to those pencils. So, but before I get into those Prismacolors, I do want to mention the fact that using just a standard HB pencil is what I want to start with, because this is what I'm going to call the construction lines. The construction lines are basically a fancy way of saying the lines that I plan with, and they help me to just set up, understand relationships, and then in the end, they're so light that I might erase them, but there's a good chance I don't even have to do that. I can just draw over on top of them and no one would even notice that they're there. The only way that I would really want to erase pencil lines is if I'm doing an ink drawing with a lot of detail, where people will, you'll be looking at a drawing with a lot of nice clean lines. You might want to erase all those pencil lines so that you don't see the kind of construction lines underneath the pen. But as we move through these first few classes, we'll be primarily using these Prismacolors, and these are the ones that are going to be used for your Milwaukee sketchbook, those 30 drawings for that first project that we talked about. So here I am now. I've got my pencil. That's what I'm going to start with. It can be any, HB is probably the most standard. That's the #2 pencil for the grade school. I mean, I don't even know if they still use this kind of stuff in grade school, #2 pencils, but anyway. I'm starting with pencil. All right. So as I look at my image, I want right away to understand where on the page my horizon line is. And I do this knowing that horizon line, and so I'm just going to very, very, very gently, so it's almost not even visible to myself. I can see it, but in the end, it might get lost. So, and that's a good thing because I don't want this to be the defining factor of the drawing. I just want to be able to reference it. Because as we saw in the photograph, you can't even really make out the horizon line. It's kind of washed out. It's like right back here, hardly visible, if at all. But I know it's there because everything is vanishing to it, and Chicago is flat, and Lake Michigan, of course, is flat at the horizon line. So once I've got this, I can start looking at proportion and relationships. So the first thing that I want, there's a kind of this picture frame. I can see these black and white drawings really make it very clear where edges are. Edges are pronounced because the relationship between is black and white. Can't get much more pronounced than that. So the first thing that I'm looking at here is this kind of picture frame. This is about a story and a half kind of window wall, probably not very well insulated or gasketed because it's built in the 50s, but it has this kind of mullion extrusion in the back, and it looks kind of cruciform. You can see it goes up to a kind of soffit condition and then down right to the ground. And so that relationship I want to start working with first, because that one I can see has a direct relationship to the horizon line. And so I'm just going to start big picture things here. I don't really want to focus on the idea of, and this is another pitfall that some people can get into, starting with an object. I don't want to do that. I don't want to draw the Barcelona chair first. I don't want to draw a plant. I don't want to draw this canopy first. I want to think big, because if I'm going to draw this view, I don't want to start with something and then just work out and around it, because then I don't know how far am I going to go. I don't know, maybe I really want to capture this table. But if I start here, I could be planning things that are too large, and then this doesn't even make it on the page. So with just a few strokes of the pencil, I want to establish some of the limits. And so that kind of, and I'm going to be using this as a 2-point perspective rather than the 1, even though you could autocorrect this in your head and make all those horizontals truly horizontal to your page. But I'm going to try to make this a little bit more dynamic and make this become a 2-point perspective, just as the photo suggests. And so a lot of what we're doing here is trying to understand proportion. And at the very beginning like this, as we just start off, we have to remember that this is a kind of, as you go, you'll say, oh, I drew this line, and I kind of check it. I see where it lies within the bigger picture. I might want to erase that line and start making a new one, but that's not a problem because we're working with construction lines. On Friday, I talked about the kneaded eraser, and here it is now unwrapped. And for those of you that have already bought it, I'm sure that you took it out of its package and have been playing with it. Kind of like putty, as I mentioned, and you can see that you stretch it and it looks very, very white. And then you collapse it and it comes back to its original color over time, which is a kind of medium gray. Over time, if you start erasing, it'll become darker and darker gray. It's not exactly going to last you forever. But indoors, when we do these tutorials, I think this is a good solution. I also have the other types in this bag, the pink and white, but I don't want to make a mess, so this is a good solution. All right. I digress with that comment, but so anyway, here we are back again. I'm starting off with this picture frame. And then I know that as I first examine this image, I have a, right about here, that's a horizon line. I'm sorry, a vanishing point on the horizon though. And so from that, I know that I'm going to start, if we connect the dot from here to here, even from here to here, or from there, and we've established this, I can do the same there. And here, so if I take that point and I imaginary line extend it down to here, I can see that that's also coming to this point. It's interesting. The more I analyze this, it's difficult to see, but sometimes as you look at things more closely, you start to learn from things. So because this is a black and white image and you're seeing it from screen, so it's probably even less apparent to you. I can see that this column actually stops at a soffit condition. So all of this really dark space from the top of the page down to that is exterior. And I didn't even realize it until now, but because it looks like this mullion stops right there, but it actually continues up to this upper rail. And so I know that there is a mullion there that I can't see, but I know that it has to be there because that's the only way that this would work. Because I can trace this, the mullion comes to the base, it has to follow this mullion to the top and then meet that rail at the top. So this changes things because I drew this line thinking that was the top rail of the mullion, but it's actually higher. So that mullion actually continues, and this line is actually the soffit on the exterior. So I'm going to continue now, knowing that this column is outside. And now, as you can see, this line that I've drawn is incorrect because initially I thought this line was the top rail of the window wall, but it's actually up here. So that line, I'm going to erase that line because I know that the ceiling of this lobby space is actually way up here and there is no line there. So right away, you can see the reason that I'm starting off with using a light pencil rather than straight into Prismacolor, which doesn't erase very well. And so now I'm starting to see how the space is coming together. And there's kind of a... So this is kind of just looking at the space that we have set up for ourselves in this regard. We can then start to populate what's happening outside. So there's another building outside the window here. And again, I'm going to do this very lightly. And we use a point that has been established. So if I have this kind of cruciform shape, that's these two mullions, the vertical and the horizontal. Then I start breaking this down. I can see this building in the distance. Again, it has these exposed columns beneath the tower. And the place where that tower is really meeting this column, which I've drawn, that's this column, they're meeting just above that mullion. And again, I know that this has to go to that same vanishing point. And then there are also going to be floor line. So the absolute, you want to measure these things and really be precise. You could really take your pencil and start doing this kind of thing. And that could be helpful to start and eventually become comfortable. And it's not as if we're trying to make photorealistic renderings here. It's all about the idea behind the design. So this canopy which comes out. Also, this face is vanishing towards that point. There's columns in the distance. And again, that there's a kind of pathway that links these two structures that you can see it starts right about here past this column and it takes us something like this. We're just seeing a little bit of the underside of this canopy. So those lines are roughly parallel to each other. There's a series of columns that march along the facade. And then there's a covered walkway that links the two buildings. There's a kind of banding that exists between the like story and a half of the lobby space. And we're actually seeing the corner of the building, which is behind this column. So you're not seeing the corner of it, but you can see the break in the two faces behind. Lakeshore Drive is kind of coming across like this. Again, the deception of the photograph. I initially thought that this line was a mullion, but it's actually a column outside of the building. So again, I am actually expanding my picture frame a little bit more. Like this. That's the mullion, another mullion there. So you can start to see depth through that. You can start to see that there's going to be some imagery outside of that window wall that's separating our interior space from our exterior. And at this point, I could start thinking more about what's happening on the interior. So I'm going to go back over time and start laying out more definitive hard lines and using my black colored pencil. But before I do that, I want to get some of the foreground. And in doing this, again, there are two Barcelona chairs in the foreground here, another two on this side, and then there are two coffee tables. The plants are kind of a whole nother animal that obviously doesn't work very well with perspective, but that you can be a little bit more free with if you even want to draw plants at all. I would advise not spending much time on that. And then I think later in the semester, I'll talk a little bit about entourage, people, cars, plant life. Okay, so for now, we're going to talk a little bit about drawing these Barcelona chairs. So the thing that I can hold true between all of these is the fact that they are still working in the same geometry as the building. Everything has depth. And there are always checks that you can do. So again, the backings of these chairs should be going roughly to that vanishing point as the edge of those chairs do as well. And then even the chrome legs that kick out from the back, the end of those are all also relating to that same vanishing point. There's actually an ottoman a little bit closer to us here and another one there. And again, they're using that same point. And then there's actually this glass coffee table that exists even closer to us. So you can see all of these faces are working together. They're all parallel to each other. So they're all going to respect that same point. This is just me showing there are some plants here. I'll come back to that. That's not the kind of thing that I want to spend too much time on. It shouldn't be the focus of the drawing, but they're there, and I don't want to forget that they're there later. So then here again, I can move on to the second coffee table, which is out here. It has 4 legs. And there's actually, so those legs, the point where they hit the ground should also be related to how they meet that vanishing point. And then on the final 2 Barcelona chairs on the opposite side. Always trust the perspective. So in this case, these 2 faces are parallel to each other. They're vanishing to that point. But then the Barcelona chair kicks down from the leading edge. And so it's kind of confusing for some that might not be new to perspective to like, I don't see the chair like I would want to see the top of it here. There's this, it's in difficult perspective and the way that it sits. So you're not going to see the top of that. But the back, you certainly will. And again, those 2, the head of both of those chairs also relate to this vanishing point. And again, those chrome pieces that come down to meet the leading edge in the back. You won't see just a little bit, you'll see some of that. So this relationship, so then again, because of I don't have the second vanishing point visible to me. It's way off the page to the left. But I can take clues from some of the geometry that I've already established. So these are all parallel to each other that are running from left to right. And so I can start to see right away there are joints on the floor, and they're also obeying the same 2 points that I've already established. And those would be the absolute lightest. I'll get into line weight at another time, but those are going to be the lightest lines. And they can help to define space and really build on the idea of depth, because the joints, although very small, they can help very much to show things that are closer to, larger panels, and things that are further away as those panels could become closer to one another. So now we can start to see some of this foreground really building. And luckily, because I'm doing construction lines, if you were building this up in another way, you'd probably have to start with the foreground objects first, because there will be overlap and things will not read very well. You would be unable to plan things in the same way. And so just for additional detail on the foreground there, the way that this coffee table works is it's a kind of cross pattern. And then here, this wall is actually glass to the corner. And then I believe this is an expressed column, so it interrupts some of that. There's a stainless steel base here. The column extends outward. And then there's probably some travertine marble up on the face. So I think with this, you can then take this drawing. The image that I have actually is cut off here. You don't see too much of what's happening on this face. So sometimes we just have to kind of, if we really think that's an important face, maybe you just say, okay, that's it. I'm stopping my drawing here. I don't need to see more. But I would argue, for the sake of this drawing, that that face might actually help us. So knowing Mies in his infinite wisdom of grid, if there's a column here, I would be willing to bet there's a column just beyond, outside of the building here. So if this is a true window wall, this keeps coming up. There would be another mullion that would turn the corner here and continue relating to that vanishing point like this. And then the question is, does that column engage the window wall or is it outboard? And we can always take a look if reference drawings give us any indicator. I'm just flipping through to see if I can find a clue. I think they would be outboard. Okay. Maybe there's baseboard heating or something here, but I would then add a mullion similarly to the corner as we found here, but I would actually reference this column and kind of take that across, and that's kind of where I would really want that to be. If I had to guess where it is, I think that's where it would be. So then there is a column out here similar to that. So there's going to be a base to that, but then this walkway is probably going to extend, or so you could walk outside the building. My horizon line continues. Lakeshore Drive is somewhere out here. And this soffit condition would also extend. So I want to add that wall because now you can really see the three faces and how they're both, these two are vanishing and this one is kind of closing off the end. All right, so hopefully you've drawn these lines in a way that they're not very dark. Some of mine are looking a little dark, I will admit, but I think for the camera, it's probably good that I do that. I could always do a, let's say I drew some of these to it, I could just go across and lighten some of those up if I need an eraser. So you can start to really take out some of the contrast of those lines, but still make out what you've got in the back. Something like this. So it's now it's been planned. I've got everything I need here to continue this drawing. And so now the question is, if it's all set up, it's really just going over what you've got and adding detail or definition. So I'm going to just start going piece by piece here. I think that the foreground is an interesting place to start because we can add a little bit more value or tone to this and just go, you're adding that thickness to things. You're kind of just elaborating on what you've already developed. Sometimes you'll start correcting things as you go, or just simply continuing what you've already done. So maybe the lines here are the most important thing you want to start with. And again, these are sketches. These are not meant to be big projects that you spend hours on. I'm hoping that these drawings are an hour, more or less. And really, it really depends on how comfortable you are at the start. So I've spent some time with the tutorial at the beginning. I'm really just going over lines now. So, and over time, each of you will become more comfortable in the way that you represent things, the line work. I'm just going quickly to get the point across here. And you can start to already see within these few lines, I can already tell that my tip is getting dull. I try to keep a series of them next to me so I'm not constantly sharpening. I can sharpen in advance and then just kind of fly through a few of them at a time. I do like the Barcelona chair. I draw a few of these. It's good to have those in the foreground because, if you drew this image without any of the furniture, it would look very bare, kind of stark. And even for Mies, that's hard to do. But the chairs do help give it some human scale in a drawing that does not have any human scale otherwise. So I can, of course, go back and work on some of this. Some of the more important lines, I'm already going to start to add a little bit. So I've developed some of these ideas in, so this is exactly what you're going to probably experience. The softness of Prismacolor is its kind of blessing and curse. You probably end up going through quite a few of them. And sometimes if you bought some at Blick or online and they're delivered to you or so on, you can see that some of them are seemingly broken even before you start drawing with them. So a lot of the times you'll have that. The tip just breaks straight off. I do not use straight edges, but I know that for some imagery, especially for modernist buildings, it really does help because a lot of modernism really relies on continuous straight edges and lines. So for instance, there's this mullion, this vertical mullion is inboard of its horizontal counterpart. And so that's a continuous line. So again, I'm getting a heavy line because it does not keep a tip for very long. So those construction lines are kind of fading away now, coming back into these with more intentional lines. I might want to come back and erase them later selectively. Now, because we're looking through a window here, you might want actually to think about the line quality of those pieces outside the glass relative to the pieces inside. So you might actually take down the pressure on your pencil on those items that are outside. So they appear to be more kind of less, they have less contrast to them. And then at the end, I might actually even give this some tone to take it down another level. Kind of like the things that are further away from you get less enhancements, so they kind of wash away. More gray tones. And that's the thing that these Prismacolor pencils can give you is the ability to go from an extreme dark to a very light gray in a way that is more than a standard, your HB pencils can do. So in the distance, just kind of like a bunch of noise, which is another way of saying like, things in the distance that you don't want to spend too much time on. You just give an illusion of things like this looks like a wintertime image or something. So it's almost like just giving an image of kind of bare trees in the distance without spending much time on these. And then we have in the distance, that's our horizon line. I jump around sometimes from one place to another. I don't focus, and this is just a personal thing. I don't really focus too much on one thing at a time. I kind of jump and go wherever. It kind of keeps my mind working on different places simultaneously. in past classes, people have asked me how to represent different facades. And so there are two basic, there's the punched opening and then the curtain wall. Uh, they're extremely different both in their technologies, but also in the way that they're represented and how they look. And so, for instance, here, Mies is, of course, using the curtain wall, which is really a series, it's a grid. And we emphasize normally, not always, one orientation or another, and usually one orientation is grouped more than the other. So Mies is famous for grouping verticals close together, but then the slab edges are expressed at a different pattern than the vision glass. So I can see all the verticals grouping closer together the further they get away from where I am, my point of view. So you can see here, I'm grouping them as they get closer and closer together, the further they are from my view on the interior of the space. And I am just hatching a little bit or filling in the slab edge. Yeah. I always make the underside, even if this is not the way that the image looks, I have the underside of things, soffits, I always try to make them look darker because I feel like those would be the places that would get the least amount of direct light. So even if the image doesn't show it right, I can see the way that the photograph is taken. This face is actually a little bit darker than the underside, but I kind of cheat. I don't really want to show it that way. And then I always want to show a light favoring one side more than the other. So I'm going to kind of take this one side, make that a bit darker. And then I know that because there's an overhang, I'm going to make this in shade as well. And then there's a band, which is probably either painted concrete or aluminum. Comes through a little there. So here again, there's this kind of chrome that Mies likes to use on a lot of these kind of picture frames. So there's a reflective quality to some of these and beautiful plants. So you can look it off. See my pencil getting quite large again because it's not sharpened like it should be. So taking those slab edges again, carrying those around the corner. And then there's this link, this canopy that is coming together to form a link between the two buildings. And again, I think I'm going to say this is just painted concrete in black. It's hard to say from the photograph, and I've only been inside this building, I think, once. Again, this is a sketch. This is not meant to be a real detailed drawing. And I can talk more about tone maybe at another time, but sometimes tone can really help to differentiate surfaces. So right now you can see like if this is nothing, this is sky, this is a soffit, but they're just the only differentiation between them is a single line. Eventually I would want to come back and add some tone to that so that I can see that there is a difference between a void and a surface. Or like even here, I know this is grass, so I turn my pencil onto the side, the flat edge, and just add some quick tone like this. always understanding that things in shadow there are things being cast in shadow where I have overhang. So and even on these interior elements, that banding that you see on the exterior out here is actually brought into the interior as well. And even there's a kind of reflective quality to these interior panels. I think this must be glass or it kind of reflects what's happening on the soffit. Actually, there's a reflection of the planet. And that line is reflected here as well. We'll go back in and really add some contrast to that soffit. And again, all the columns are also painted black. Like, and I'm using the side of my pencil just to get some more uniformity. You could also use the tip, but then it'll probably take longer, but it will also start, um, you'll see more of that line work where you might not want it. Okay. They're making jumping around, but I know that these chairs have these kind of button patterns. And then just adding a little bit of tone to really differentiate this. And sometimes I'll even just add a little bit of shadow to the underside of these furniture pieces just to show that they are actually anchored somehow to the floor. They're not just floating. And beautiful leaves. It's also important to understand that where you add contrast is where your eye will go. So when you're looking at a drawing, even though something might look really, really dark, you don't want to draw attention to it. So for instance, these foreground plants, I don't really want them to be the foreground focus. But I can tell now I'm starting to add quite a bit of tone to them, and so they're going to kind of automatically become something of focal point. So I might want to counteract that with something else in the foreground that has more contrast. So just because I see something in a photo doesn't mean that I'm going to replicate it just as it's photographed, because I have to always worry about how that's going to be perceived. A little bit of tone to make edge to me look a little bit darker. Things in the foreground and get a little bit more detail. There's always going to be depth to these mullions. Going back and make sure I'm treating columns similarly to one another. So I look at what I did there and I might want to do the same thing. Otherwise, that could be confused as being something aside from a kind of similar column. It could look like a wall from another building or something. I want to make sure that I'm being consistent. And then that soffit, which continues outside of the building enclosure. And again, I don't have this inside the photo that I've been given, but you know what? I'm gonna just say, I'm kind of taking a guess here. No one is gonna say, what are you talking about? There's no tree there. There is now. Let me put one there. Don't want to spend much time on this kind of thing. It's really like a style that you kind of develop over time. You don't want people to be like, wow, look at that drawing. Those trees are great. I don't know about the rest of that building, but the trees are good. Not the point of the drawing. And so I'm coming to a point now where, for the sake of this tutorial, I want to try to wrap it up because I don't want people to see this as being like a big project that lasts for hours. Of course, I would want to go back and redefine. I want to get more definition on some of this foreground here because it's prominent, it's well placed, and I think that the last thing that I would want to do, maybe add a little bit more here and there just to touch it up, but maybe just a little bit more of that foreground, like I was talking about with the joints and the just very, very, very subtle, very light. Just enhance this to show that the kind of travertine that Mies likes to use is coming through into the floor. And just a few more joints to show that there's that depth that moves from one to the foreground back. Not like I'm measuring these things, it's just and even on the outside of this probably a concrete walkway. We can continue those joints. So this is really the kind of level that I'm hoping that we can all get to in this class. You know, there's a simplicity to it. It's obviously not photorealistic. It's not like the kind of thing that you're going to spend so much time on. It's just getting the idea across. And so I want to hear your thoughts on Friday when we come into class. We talk about this. Hopefully, a lot of you have spent time working on it and follow along. And yeah, Friday is going to be focusing again on perspective, just as we've done here with another image, as well as composition. So this is probably a good place to end. I thank you for taking the time and following along. And I look forward to speaking to you and doing another tutorial, getting into some of the details here next class.